Greetings. My name is Paul Denai. I serve as North Park Theological Seminary as a professor of missiology and intercultural studies. And on behalf of North Park Seminary faculty and staff, it is my great pleasure to welcome each of you to our third and final public theology session of this academic year. And we want to thank you for being part of this event. I want to express a special thanks to Luke Pomerly for his administrative coordination, keeping us going behind the scenes, and to the Lilly Endowment for their financial scholarship. And one note, we are streaming this live and recording it in speaker view, but if you have any concerns, you may turn off your camera and you can stay muted until Max or others open that up for you. We're now in the third year of these public conversations, which were prompted originally by the new restrictions and new questions of COVID. And our theme this year, centered in the storm, is focused on resting in Christ, not as an escape from the needs of the world, but as a necessary means to the transformative work of the church in today's world. And we want to reflect on Jesus' invitation in Matthew 11:28-30. Today's session, Sabbath without Sabbatical, Pastoral Rest in the Midst of Ministry, is brought to you by our Bible Field. So to lead us in this discussion, we're grateful and honored to be joined by four outstanding guests: Dr. Carmen Imes, Reverend Raymond Chang, Reverend Reese Sky, and Dr. Dennis Edwards. And my colleague, Dr. Max Lee, the Paul Brandel Chair of Biblical Studies and Professor of New Testament, will be introducing our speakers at a greater length. But before turning it over to Dr. Lee to get us started, I want to invite us to begin with a moment of silence to center ourselves. And I will read the text for this year, Matthew 11:28-30 in the Message version, followed by a minute of silence, which I will break. Join me in a moment of reflection. Are you tired, worn out, burned out? Come to me. Get away with me, and you'll recover your life. I'll show you how to take a real rest. Walk with me and work with me. Watch how I do it. Learn the unforced rhythms of grace. I won't lay anything heavy or ill-fitting on you. Keep company with me, and you'll learn to live freely and lightly. Turn it over now to Dr. Max Lee to introduce our speakers and to begin today's session.
Great. Thank you very much for that introduction. I wanted to let everyone know that the theme for this session is called Sabbath without Sabbatical, Pastoral Rest in the Ministry Field, sponsored by the Biblical Field. We wanted to ask the question, what is Sabbath from a biblical and theological perspective? But we also wanted to ask questions for the pastor and the Christian leader, how they can experience a Sabbath rest in the midst of a busy ministry and competing demands, especially when their church may not be able to afford a sabbatical or extended leave of absence from ministry. And so this is an important question. I think, especially in a post-COVID era, the theme of exhaustion seems to be something that our pastors and our Christian leaders have constantly voiced over and over again. We're overworked and worked hard, yet we're trying to be faithful. And we can't take time off in terms of a leave of absence, but perhaps in the regular rhythms of life and ministry, we might be able to celebrate a Sabbath rest. And so to this end, I'm very grateful for our panelists. Let me introduce our first speaker. This is Dr. Carmen Imes, is Associate Professor of Old Testament at Biola University's Talbot School of Theology in La Mirada, California. And she's the author of several publications, including Bearing God's Name, Why Sinai Still Matters, and in press and able to be ordered. Her next book by InterVarsity Press is Being God's Image, Why Creation Still Matters. You can get that now. Dr. Imes has appeared on more than 50 podcasts and radio shows and launched her own YouTube channel where she releases weekly Torah Tuesday videos. She's a guest blogger for Christianity Today, Political Theology Network, and The Well, InterVarsity's blog for women in the academy and professions. Before
She's
earning
part
her
of the
PhD
Well for InterVarsity.
Yes, and before earning her PhD from Wheaton College, Carmen and her husband served as missionaries in the Philippines with SIM International, reaching out to ethnic ministries. Welcome, Professor Imes. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. This is a joy to be with all of you today. I would say from sunny Southern California, but it isn't sunny today, or at least we can't see the sun. We've got a lot of clouds, and so it's a cooler spring day. As we've just come off of Holy Week, and we've all been thinking about the resurrection, I was struck by the way that Jesus' resurrection is described. And I promise I will get to the Old Testament. That was my assignment. But I thought, as I heard the story again this weekend, it struck me the role that Sabbath plays in the resurrection story. So I want to just begin by reading from Luke chapter 23, starting in verse 54. This is right after Joseph of Arimathea takes Jesus' body and places him in the tomb. And we're told it was preparation day and the Sabbath was about to begin. The women who had come with Jesus from Galilee followed Joseph and saw the tomb and how his body was laid in it. Then they went home and prepared spices and perfumes, but they rested on the Sabbath in obedience to the commandment. On the first day of the week, very early in the morning, the women took the spices they had prepared and went to the tomb. And I think what's striking to me about this is not only did these female disciples of Jesus who had been following him and learning from him and had devoted their lives to his teaching, not only are they still keeping the Sabbath, but they're doing so in a time of great crisis where they probably could have made the case that this is an exception to the rule, that we don't need to keep the Sabbath today because we have an emergency on our hands. We have a dead Messiah and we want to honor his body, but they haven't set aside the command to keep the Sabbath. And not only that, but we also have Jesus who manages to die on time so that he can observe the Sabbath, and he rests on the Sabbath in the tomb. There's an expression of surprise in the Gospels that Jesus died so quickly, and his crucifixion happens in the afternoon. And he dies early enough that his body can be wrapped by Joseph and placed in the tomb before the beginning of the Sabbath. And so many Christians, when the topic of the Sabbath comes up, many Christians say, well, isn't that the command we don't have to keep? That's an Old Testament thing. That's the command that's been set aside in Christ. Sabbath is for people who are legalists. Or legalistic. I'm guessing that those of you on this call have already been persuaded that Sabbath matters in some sense, and that's why you're here. You want to talk about it. But for any who are still feeling skeptical, I thought this moment at Jesus' resurrection might be a good place to start. Students will often say to me, isn't that the command we don't have to keep? And my response to them is, why wouldn't you want the Sabbath? This is God telling his people, I don't want you to work like slaves, like someone else owns you and like you have to keep producing 24/7. I want you and everyone in your household to have a day off. And it's baffling to me why we wouldn't receive that as a gift. So what I'd like to do today is, in this short time that I have, is give you the Old Testament background of the Sabbath. Where do we get this paradigm? How does God train his people to keep it? What is its purpose and what pattern does it set for us? But I hope to give you a picture that this is something that's a gift and it's joy-filled. If you've ever traveled to Israel and been there on the Sabbath, then you've experienced what I have, which is the whole city grinding to a halt, all the commerce shutting down, no cars on the streets, and instead what you have are joyful homes filled with families singing together, eating together, going for walks together. It doesn't feel legalistic, it feels joyful. So I think there's a possibility here for us to receive Sabbath as a gift. So the paradigm, of course, comes at the very beginning of our Bibles, Genesis 1 and 2, where God creates the world in a pattern of 6 days. The creative work happens over a period of 6 days, and then the seventh is that day of rest. And I'm convinced there are, of course, lots of debates over how should we understand Genesis 1 and 2? How are they functioning? Is this telling us how God made the world and how long it took him? Or is it showing us why God made the world and what we're here for? But wherever you fall on the spectrum, I think it's clear that the creation story is meant to provide a paradigm for us to follow, that just as God created in 6 days and then rested, so we should do our creative work in 6 days and then rest. God gives his people practice with this just the moment they come out of Egypt. They've been working as slaves for Pharaoh. They're into the wilderness, and before they even get to Sinai and get the law, God begins providing for his people in a cycle of 6 days. He gives them manna 6 days out of 7. And on the 7th day, if they get up and try to go out and collect manna, there's nothing there. And I think of this story in Exodus 16 about the manna as a set of training wheels. God is showing his people that his pattern of provision for them is such that they are able to rest, because he's going to provide enough for them on day 6 so that they can rest on day 7. And so it's a kind of training wheels for people as they come to trust him as provider. And then, of course, in Exodus 20, we get the 10 Commandments. And we're told in Exodus 20 what the purpose is of this rest. Now, growing up, my family talked about the Sabbath, and there were certain things we were not allowed to do on Sundays. We couldn't go out to eat. We couldn't spend money at stores. We didn't do shopping on Sundays. We wouldn't have gone to the movies on Sunday. Those things are fine on other days of the week, but Sunday was supposed to be resting and letting other people rest. When I was a kid, it felt legalistic to me. It felt like I didn't understand the purpose of the rule. It seemed strange and unnecessarily restrictive. But the 10 Commandments tell us why the Sabbath is to be kept. So starting in Exodus 20, verse 8, it reads, "Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath to Yahweh your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son or daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns. For in 6 days Yahweh made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, but he rested on the 7th day. Therefore Yahweh blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy." The 10 Commandments have been the focus of my doctoral work and writing since then. And I'm convinced that they provide a paradigm in which the power of the patriarch is being restrained for the good of everyone else. My mentor, Dan Block, calls this the Bill of Other People's Rights. We think of the Bill of Rights in our own country, but the Bill of Other People's Rights is I need to make it my responsibility to look out for the needs of my neighbor. And so in this case, in the Decalogue that's being addressed to male heads of households, they are being told not just you get to have a rest 1 day a week, but it's actually your responsibility to ensure that everyone in your household gets a day of rest. This is not a day for the head of household to sit back, cross his arms, put up his feet and say, "Wife, bring me more beer." This is a day in which the entire family gets a chance to rest, including male and female servants and animals. And so I think here, if we linger on this, we can see that there's a bent towards freedom and a guardrail against exploitation that's being set up with this command that I find really inspiring. In Deuteronomy chapter 5, the command gets repeated to the next generation. Moses is restating God's law from Sinai to the next generation before they enter the promised land. And what's most striking about the repeated 10 Commandments is that the justification for the Sabbath command has changed. In Exodus, the justification is creation. God did his work in 6 days and then rested, so you need to follow that pattern. But in Deuteronomy 5, verse 12 and following, the reason given for the Sabbath is this: remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and that Yahweh your God brought you out of there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore, Yahweh your God has commanded you to observe the Sabbath day. This is striking for lots of reasons, but chiefly among them, the people Moses is talking to were in fact not slaves in Egypt. They were born in the wilderness. It was their parents' generation that were slaves in Egypt. But God wants every generation to see that he has rescued them from Egypt, to adopt the story of the Exodus as their story. And so he says here to this next generation, you need to remember that I set you free from slavery. Don't treat yourselves, don't order your lives as though you are slaves, as though you're working nonstop for someone else. This is not a sustainable way of life. And so I think the thing to know about the Sabbath from an Old Testament perspective is that it is not a matter of legalism. It's a matter of freedom. It's giving God's people freedom and giving the families and communities freedom from having to work all of the time, and to orient their lives around that freedom instead of around slavery. And I think in this day and age, we often enslave ourselves by continuing to say yes to more and more and more, and to fill every day of the week with so much to do that we are never able to unplug. And so we end up being our own slave masters by keeping our notifications on and by checking our email 24/7. The one other thing I'll leave you with, because I think I'm probably out of time now, is just the pattern that Sabbath sets up. So it's 1 day in 7, but there's also 1 year in 7, and then one Jubilee year that's after 7 sets of 7 years. And so it's not just the weekly pattern that gets set up by divine decree. There's nothing cosmological to set up the world in a cycle of 7 days. It's just by divine decree. But that becomes the basis for how the Israelites are to think about time and how they're to think about freedom. So the land gets to rest 1 year in 7, and then the land gets an extra day of rest one year after 7 cycles of 7s, and all the laws about employment and about debt revolve around that decree of freedom, which is just, I think, a beautiful thing. So I expect that as we continue on in our conversation and as we hear from other presenters, we're going to get into more of the nitty-gritty of the principles of Sabbath, the ways of living that out when you're in a ministry context, and weekends are your busiest time in ministry. And so we'll kind of flesh that out more. And I have some thoughts on that, but I don't want to steal the thunder of those who are still coming. So I'll save those thoughts for our discussion.
Wonderful. Wow. You gave so much to think about. I was really struck by the responsibility of not exploiting labor. That Sabbath is responsibility, a communal responsibility, and that's part of our expression of bearing witness to life with God. Thank you. I think there's going to be a lot of questions just on that note alone, but we need to move on. So I'm going to introduce our next speaker. And by the way, those of you who are online, feel free to ask your questions as they come in the chat. I will be keeping track of the questions for our panelists. If you want us to read the question for you, I can do that. Otherwise, when you write the question out, I will call upon you in our time together, and you can unmic yourself, ask your question directly, and then put yourself back on mute as we hear the response. Our next speaker needs no introduction because he's our Dean of Seminary, Dr. Dennis Edwards, and he's also a professor of New Testament and the Vice President for Church Relations at North Park University. He is a prolific author, and his works include Might from the Margins, The Gospel's Power to Turn the Tables on Injustice, and his recently also published book with IV Press, Humility Illuminated, the biblical path back to Christian character. He received his doctorate from the Catholic University of America and is an ordained covenant minister. Dr. Edwards has served as a lead pastor for churches in New York City, Washington, D.C., and Minneapolis, and lives in Chicagoland area with his wife, Susan. Thank you for speaking on the New Testament.
Yeah, thank you, Max. So, excuse me, my voice has been weak a little bit, but I'm really honored to be with you all and to be sharing. And Dr. Imes, I was fascinated. I think, perhaps from a New Testament perspective, or maybe from a popular church perspective, the reason why we think of Sabbath in those legalistic ways is because there are these episodes in the New Testament where Jesus gets confronted by religious leaders for doing something on the Sabbath that he presumably should not be doing. But I do think that that the teachings that Jesus give in those instances kind of reinforce some of your points. But there's one particular episode that I want to look at and then make some observations as we move ahead. It's one I often share with my New Testament students. It's Mark chapter 3, verses 1 through 6. It's just a few verses, so I'll read it. Again, he entered the synagogue, and a man was there who had a withered hand. They watched him to see whether he would cure him on the Sabbath so that they might accuse him. And when he said to the man who had the withered hand, "Come forward," then he said to them, "Is it lawful to do good or to do harm on the Sabbath, to save life or to kill?" But they were silent. He looked around at them with anger. He was grieved at their hardness of heart and said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and his hand was restored. The Pharisees went out and immediately conspired with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him. Well, the conclusion of that story could deal with at another time. I mean, that's pretty dramatic ending there. They want to kill or destroy Jesus. But it's that interchange about the Sabbath, that here Jesus sees this man in this condition. They're checking him out to see if he's going to do something on this day. One of the things I think that comes out for me in the story is that Jesus sees the man's condition more than the concern over what day of the week it is. And in his healing of this man, the word that I think of, it's there in verse 5, is restoration. He was restored. And there's something in that the folks who appear to make Sabbath be a legalistic thing are the ones who Jesus gets angry with. In fact, he really is angry there. It says that's one of the couple of times in Mark's gospel where Jesus is angry. And perhaps he's angry because they see they're focusing on the calendar and not on the condition of this man. And I think one of the things that I feel like the New Testament is teaching us about Sabbath is that it is about restoration. And here it's restoration in body, but restoration in body and soul and mind. So we're not rejecting the notion of Sabbath, although I also grew up similarly where we couldn't do certain things. I mean, I went to church, started going to church when I was, I guess, around junior high school age when we started going, and there were things we could not do on a Sunday. But the kind of church I went to called itself holiness. So there were things we couldn't do anytime. Things like, playing cards and that kind of stuff. But I even lived in cities that had so-called blue laws where you couldn't buy alcohol on a Sunday or certain things like that. And you can't get your Chick-fil-A sandwich on a Sunday. So there are ways that we look at Sabbath that could feel legalistic, even though they're meant to be restorative in body, soul, and mind. This passage that we get to comes right after Jesus has said a couple of other things about Sabbath at the end of Mark chapter 2. He says in 2:27, the Sabbath was made for humankind and not humankind for the Sabbath. So that seems to me a rebuke for those who would see the Sabbath as a legalistic kind of an enterprise that I'm supposed to not do, and think of it in terms of limitation as opposed to restoration. So the Sabbath being made for humankind, not humankind for the Sabbath, that means it's supposed to benefit me, not be a pain or a difficulty for me. And then the very next part of that phrase, he says, so the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. So this, I think, is also teaching us that the way we Sabbath or the way we approach Sabbath is modeled in the way Jesus did it. It was a a day for restoration. He did other healings also on the Sabbath that he got criticized for. And then also this notion that he being Lord of the Sabbath means that, well, we can model the way we Sabbath after Jesus, because we just read it at the top of our session here, the verses that have been guiding us out of Matthew chapter 11, that the way of Jesus is one of, depending on your translations, it will say he's humble of heart or lowly of heart, and he's gentle. So we can take on this kind of a yoke, that the yoke he gives us is easy, his burden is light. So counteracting the notion of legalism is the way of Jesus, that is a way of restoring, a way of us bearing things lightly, because he's not an oppressive Lord. So if he's Lord of Sabbath, that means that's the way we should also Sabbath. One of the things that I think that informs my own New Testament scholarship are the years of pastoral ministry that I've been engaged in. So when I was a young person, I mentioned the legalistic kind of world that I grew up in and such. But then as I became a pastor myself, a young pastor, I found myself stretched tremendously. I won't tell all those stories now, but maybe when we have some Q&A, I can share more. But one episode that happened, I went to a session to get some counsel. There was a group of pastors and we was a facilitator. And this person said something that I have repeated many times over the years, and I've shared it in other places. He talked about pastors that were burning out, and they would get to this place and say, you know, I'm done with the ministry. And the leader there, the facilitator, reminded us, he said, look, your life's not your ministry. Your ministry is your life. And there was something that, yeah, I think I might have said that backwards. The ministry is not my life, rather. My life is my ministry. Thank you. I said it backwards. Yeah, my life is my ministry. The way I live my life is ministry. So if that's true, then that means there ought to be a rhythm that we see modeled with Jesus, you know, who could take a nap in a boat. So I like this kind of thing. So for me, the New Testament is teaching us not so much what we can and can't do, but the purpose being a restorative purpose, one that restores us in body, soul, and mind. So I'll stop there.
Great, thank you for bringing another theme. I think we're seeing that whatever Sabbath is a constellation of themes and purposes for Sabbath for our good and the good of our communities. We heard the element of guarding against exploitation and the justice component. And now a larger goal of restoration, which would make sense why the healings were so important to Jesus,
Yeah, I think
even
so.
on the Sabbath.
I think so.
So and to not be, if the goal is in fact us to restore us to God and hopefully to each other too.
Yeah, amen.
All right, amen. A friendly reminder, as questions come and I'm seeing them, please write them in the chat, and know that in the order in which they appear, I'll ask them in our Q&A. Our next presenter is the Reverend Reese Sky, a pastor, preacher, worship leader, and songwriter. She and her husband, Phil, are co-pastors of On Raps Covenant Church, an intentional, multi-class, multi-ethnic, multi-generational church in the Lowell neighborhood of Fresno, California. She published her first book, Let the People Worship, in 2016. It's a 40-day devotional. And she released her praise and worship album, Let the People Sing, in 2017. She holds a bachelor's and master's degree in education from Fresno Pacific University, where she teaches as an adjunct professor, and received a master's of Christian formation from North Park Seminary. Her greatest gift these days is being Mama Sky to a bunch of teens who hang out in her basement and call themselves the Basement Kids. Thank you for joining us, Reverend Sky. Floor is yours.
All right, so great to be with you all today. Dr. Imes, it is actually sunny here in Fresno, so loving the sun here for sure. Author Kirk Byron Jones, in his book Rest in the Storm, he said this. He said, we get so caught up in trying to do things for God that we forget that all he wants is for us to spend time with him. He then asks the question, what good is service to God if we have lost the Lord in our purpose for serving? And if I can be just completely transparent today, I can say that this was my testimony. I lost the Lord in my purpose for serving. I said yes to every invitation to preach. I said yes to every invitation to teach. I said yes to every invitation to convene a workshop or to facilitate a conversation. As long as it was ministry related, I said yes to it. And rest was actually, unlike Dr. Edwards and Dr. Imes, rest was actually a foreign concept for me and my upbringing. It was almost looked down upon, actually. It was this concept of all gas, no brakes, or the harder you work, the more you love the Lord. And so it was a really twisted paradigm of the function of rest in ministry. And honestly, as a Black woman in pastoral ministry, I was given faulty instructions, not by any of the professors at North Park. They're amazing, but I was given faulty instructions. I was taught to say yes to every invitation, because how else would the requesting group or ministry hear from a woman's perspective or hear from a Black American's perspective? And I pridefully shouldered this burden as if God's kingdom work and will depended on me, as if it started and ended with me. And it didn't take long for me to realize that every yes was an automatic no to something else or someone else. And I found myself, again, just being completely transparent, I found myself struggling with hopelessness. I found myself struggling with depression and with anxiety. I found myself struggling with imposter syndrome and compassion fatigue. I found myself struggling with vicarious traumatization and, yes, even direct trauma. And I was actually beyond burnout. Whatever that next level is, that's where I was, beyond burnout. Not to mention the betrayal, the pain, the harm, and the hurt caused by so many who were close to me that I thought I could trust. You know, we talk a lot about church hurt, but we don't really discuss pastoral hurt and what that looks like. And I understand that could be another conversation for another time. But I found myself in this place of desperation saying, God, you called me to this, but I'd much rather go be a barista at Starbucks right now. Like, honestly, I'm so exhausted. I'm so hopeless. And I feel like there is no light at the end of the tunnel. And if there is a light at the end of the tunnel, it's a train coming to knock me over. And so March 2022, after 10 and a half years in pastoral ministry, I had an opportunity to take a 3-month sabbatical where I could rest and where I could reflect and where I could respond to whatever it was that God wanted to do in my life. Because you see, for me, up until that point, I had observed my Sabbath on Wednesdays. Ironically, today's Wednesday. I had observed my Sabbath on Wednesdays, but the more I struggled with hopelessness and depression and anxiety and imposter syndrome, the less Wednesdays felt like a Sabbath to me. And they started to just feel like a day off. What do I mean? A day off for me, it was where, Dr. Imes, I would actually take a look at my messages and my emails. And even though they would start off with, hey, Pastor Reese, I know today is your Sabbath, but, and then the request would come. I found myself responding to those requests on Wednesdays, the day that was supposed to be set aside for my Sabbath. But again, it just became a day off. A day off for me was where I would actually just veg out in front of the TV, eating the greasiest and sweetest junk food I could find, with laundry going and the dogs barking and doom scrolling through social media all at the same time, really just trying to breathe and numb whatever emotional pain I was feeling at the time. I realize now that I was simply just trying to survive and recover, but I was not observing a Sabbath. A Sabbath, I love the way that Pete Scazzero describes Sabbath. Sabbath is for the Lord. Day off was for me. Sabbath is for the Lord. A Sabbath where I am able to stop and rest and delight and contemplate. Again, I love the way Pete Scazzero describes Sabbath, where again, I'm able to stop, rest, delight, and contemplate. where I am actually able to set my phone notifications to do not disturb, where I am able to rest and to spend time at the park feeding the ducks and walking my dogs and just enjoying the beautiful sun that Fresno has to offer. My one of my pastors, Elder Eric Claiborne, he says this. He said, as I was coming back from sabbatical, he said, Reese, you need to discern when to go full throttle and when to back off. He said, because both are commentary on my faith in God. And it was when he said that I was able to remember that the Sabbath is actually an opportunity for me to trust that God is who he says he is. And that I don't have to do that. I don't have to do all of that work. I can just trust in who God says he is. The Sabbath, where I spend intentional time in prayer in my prayer room in my basement with no real agenda other than just to be his daughter, be his friend, be courageous and confess all of my doubts and troubles and just be in communion with him, where I don't have to perform for him. I can just rest. And now I live by Dr. Jim Bruckner's quote in one of our Old Testament classes as sort of a side note. He said, show me a preacher who doesn't rest, and I'll show you a preacher I don't trust. And all of my colleagues, all of us pastors and preachers, we just kind of looked at each other like, whoa, like that was a word of correction for me for sure. Because see, I don't want to be one who doesn't rest and is therefore not trustworthy, right? In my congregation, in my community, among the basement kids who are always in my home. Like, I want to be trustworthy. I want to be safe. I want to be that non-anxious presence in their lives. I want to experience true hope and, yes, true freedom, Dr. Imes. But I realize that none of this will ever be true if I don't stop, if I don't rest, if I don't delight, and if I don't contemplate. And so that's what Sabbath means to me. Sabbath without sabbatical. What does it look like for pastors to rest in the midst of ministry?
Wow. Thank you so much for sharing. Thank you for articulating and putting the language, I think some real pain that we all resonate with. But so much to think about, that a day off, surviving, that's not Sabbath. And that Sabbath, a day off of Sabbath is time for me, but not for God. I think one of the questions I'm sure will pop up in the chat, and I'll ask it if it doesn't, is what are some good practices for Sabbath? Yeah, I think that you really bring that to the forefront of our conversation. So thank you so much. The conversation's good and it's getting better. So I wanted to now introduce our fourth panelist. Reverend Raymond Chang is the president of the Asian American Christian Collaborative and the executive director for the 10x10 collaboration, an initiative of the Fuller Youth Institute at Fuller Seminary. As an active preacher and writer, he speaks throughout the country on issues pertaining to Christianity and culture and race and faith. He has lived throughout the world: Korea, Guatemala, Panama, Spain, China, traveled to nearly 50 countries. I think actually you did that. You just flew a backpack and toured Europe one time, right? Whoa. I remember hearing that story. And is currently pursuing his PhD in education at the Azusa Pacific University. He lives in the Chicagoland area with his wife, Jessica, and the proud father of a newborn. So congratulations.
Thank you.
All right.
Well, it means a lot to be invited. Max, Dr. Lee, was actually a professor of mine when I was a student at Wheaton. He messed me up in some good ways, and it's always great to be with the myth and the legend, Dr. Edwards, and all of our esteemed fellow panelists. So I think as I heard what people shared, I'm going to cut some of the things that I was planning to share, but it'll still work because a lot of what other people said were things that I would have wanted to allude to. But I think for me, rest was never modeled. Growing up in an immigrant home to Korean American parents who had to hustle just to survive, I never saw them rest. From Monday to Saturday, they were actually at a restaurant down the street from here in North Park, not too far on Elston and Kimball, called Chang's Chinese Restaurant, which is now a Mexican burrito joint where my dad learned how to cook Chinese food, despite being Korean, because mostly people didn't know what Koreans were or Korean food was outside of Koreatown. And all I really saw them do all my life was work. Even our vacations were tied to work. One time we went to New York to pick up a machine or equipment, and I thought we were on a family vacation. We were in New York City for 2 hours, and then we drove straight back. And what I found was that nothing was really ever done for leisure or rest, and none of those words are really in our lexicon. And I think they never knew what rest was because they never saw someone truly rest themselves. And I don't blame that because they grew up in post-war conditions in Korea, and then having to restart their lives in a completely new country demands a lot. And what I've seen from my parents almost all their lives is that they had to hustle just to survive and provide for us. And I never saw rest model because my parents existed between never having seen it for themselves or being able to afford to actually rest. This is actually the backdrop of where I'm approaching this conversation. So in full disclosure, I'm in the process. I'm a recovering resting person who's trying to figure out how to do better. Like many others, I'm stretched thin, so thin that I feel like I often have no margin. And leading 2 organizations and now being a father of a newborn who's just 1 month old, I almost always feel like I don't have enough slack at the end of the rope. But this is often why it's helpful to take a step back and to even try to think through the ways that God had patterned rest for us, as this conversation is showing. And here are some that I'm not going to go into detail, but without it. Our bodies are finite. Our bodies remind us that it's so. And literally, if we don't rest, we'll lose our mind if we don't sleep for enough days. And people actually did studies to show how, if you don't sleep for days on end, that it can have some devastating effects. The second thing is that rest is an act of worship. This is what Dr. Imes kind of alluded to earlier. I think rest is also an act of faith. We don't just rest because we need it, but we also accept our finitude, and we trust that God is the one that's going to provide, and that our trust in God is demonstrated through our rest. And I actually love how the book of Hebrews oftentimes equates rest to faith, that faith and rest are one and the same. And then finally, that rest is an act of resistance. It says no to the demands of busyness and to many of the assumptions of the world, and it says yes to God. Now, as I reflected on this talk, I thought of a few people that I've encountered throughout my life, including people who are not in vocational ministry, and asked what Sabbath without a sabbatical might mean for them. I thought about a group of Korean pastors that I talked with years ago who shared that they had small fledgling congregations, primarily serving the poor, that their congregations couldn't support them to the point that even after taking on a part-time job, which is very shame-inducing for Koreans, as pastors, they often had to go on involuntary fasts and sometimes even put their families on an involuntary fast to join them because there wasn't enough money at the end of the month. I think of church planters who need to quickly grow because they know that their funding is going to eventually run out. I think of the single mother who is working full time and maybe multiple jobs, taking care of their kid. I think of the blue collar worker who can't make enough to make ends meet, even though they're working 80 hours a week at 3 different jobs. I think of the immigrant church pastor who works with a congregation where people are truly giving in sacrificial ways so that the church can keep its door open and its ministry running, where the pastor is exhausted, but it would be impossible for the pastor to take a sabbatical knowing that many of the congregants could never afford any sabbatical for themselves, and the pressure that places on them. And so the question I've been asking is, how do you rest when there's no time to rest, when there's no resources to rest? How do you find margin when there's no slack? What do you do when work means survival and rest means that your kids won't eat? What do you do when there's no rest for the weary? How does the rubber meet the road in the promises of God to provide? And I find myself thinking of these people in how I frame my own understanding of rest. Now, on the one hand, there are some key things that we can all do. We know that if we don't take control over our calendar and our schedules, that someone else eventually will, and that we don't, and if we don't create some clarity in terms of expectation, that especially as pastors, since people will demand more of us than we can humanly give, Yet oftentimes if we offer clarity, it ends up feeling like we're betraying them or neglecting them to them, which is a real dynamic and tension to work through. But at the same time, in many settings, it's almost impossible to guard our times in the ways that we want and even should. But where we can exercise some control or agency, I think there's at least 7 ways that we ought to try to incorporate in our lives, seven practical things. Where possible, and if possible, take a full Sabbath. Pastors, others will do what you model. If needed and possible, begin your Sabbath on Sunday evening and end it on Monday evening. For many pastors, Sunday is a big event. You can't take Saturday off. Many pastors seem to take Monday off, but not everyone can, especially if you're on the list of those people that I mentioned above. If this is impossible, then try to block off 2 or 3 substantive chunks of time where you're actually disrupting the things that make their demands upon you. Establish rhythms to the best of your ability, knowing when you work best, and make sure that you have the right blend of life-giving and life-draining responsibilities and tasks scattered throughout the day. Don't fill your entire schedule in any given day with only life-draining activities. Put technology away where possible. Other people have covered this. Disrupt your work. This is really hard if you have to clock in and clock out, but most pastors have enough flexibility and freedom to disrupt the work that they're doing. So go take a walk, go to the gym, go play some sports with congregants. I mean, the number of immigrant populations and minoritized populations that you speak to, most of the discipleship happens in the mundane day-to-day running errands. Take advantage of that. Prioritize well. This is one of the hardest things for leaders to do because we always move to the urgent and we neglect them. So know how to prioritize. Prayer, disciplines of abstinence as well. I often talk about the 5 S's, which are slowing, silence, solitude, sleep, and secrecy. Where you can engage with those things, you do those because they offer microbursts of Sabbath. Most of you will know what the other 4 are, like slowing, silence, solitude, and sleep. But just in case you don't know what secrecy is, it's basically doing something good for someone without making sure that no one knows you did it, because it then kind of it forms your spirit to not need the attention and the credit everywhere you go. And then finally, if you can't find ways to rest, then schedule it. Block off your calendar where it's possible. I know that's very hard, but do the discipline of exercise the discipline of doing so. Now, I know this is already hard with little margin, but what do you do if you have 0 margin? You see, rest often feels like a choice for the people who have resources to be able to take advantage of it. But if you think about the people that I mentioned, most of them don't have the time to rest. Even if they wanted to, they would struggle to. And here's why. Our society is built around transaction, and it's primarily oriented around extraction and exploitation. The world tells us that we're only as valuable as what we can produce or offer and what people can get out of us. And so, our society is designed around what we can get out of a person instead of being designed around what can lead to the flourishing of people and what can lead to them becoming more human and contribute and finding ways for them to contribute their God-given gifts to the rest of society in a godly manner. So as long as extraction and exploitation are the driving forces of our society, people are going to get paid the least amount of money for the most amount of work that could be expected and required from them. And they're going to be defined by the production and the value of their hours, and people will get squeezed more than they could possibly ever get taken from them. And this doesn't even account for the fact that people perform better if they're well rested. So then what we need to realize is that in addition to rest being a basic human need, an act of faith and an act of worship, it's also a site of resistance. It's a site of resistance to the extractive and exploitative patterns of the world. It's a site of resistance to say that our provision truly comes from God and not from anyone else. And it's a site of resistance that demonstrates that we're not going to perpetuate unjust systems. But it cannot be a site of individual resistance alone. This is where I think makes rest in the world of busyness nearly impossible. You see, we were made for community. And in our day and age where the hero is the autonomous self that never needs help, the Bible tells us that we are one body with many parts and that no one can do or engage in ministry alone. We see it in Exodus with Moses, where he needed to appoint leaders to share the burden. And also in the apostles, when they appointed deacons like Stephen, Moses couldn't hold the staff up on his own. He needed help and support. And while so much falls on the individual today, the fact that we live in a system that's primarily oriented to extract and exploit means that we'll never really have rest if we're truly autonomous and self-reliant, especially for those in the margins. This is why the resistance of rest needs to be practiced in community. As pastors, we often feel like we have to bear the brunt of everything on our shoulders. We've been taught a centralized model of ministry where everything has to come through us and flow from us. And I actually think that there are some elements which the office of pastor should have primary oversight for, but there are many other things that we can turn over. And while over COVID, one of the things I kept encouraging pastors to do was to turn things over. If you zero in on the things that you only you can do and empower others to do the things that they can do, you'd be actually surprised at how much people can accomplish when they're on mission together and if you trust them with responsibility. Of course, this also means that you're taking risks, but the risks are worth it, especially if you have community to discern what's needed. Now, while we should never use our office and roles to take from our communities, we're also called to shape the communities we lead and to call for rhythms of rest and resist the pressures to be hyper autonomous and self-reliant. We can free up time that's going to be critical for getting rest. So, and the way that we do that is actually by sharing burdens and finding ways to get people to share resources with one another, especially those who are most needy. It's usually cheaper for 1 or 2 people to cook for 10 people than for 5 people to cook for themselves. There's something beautiful about the scene in Acts 4 where there was no one needy among the people as people move towards dispossession. And I think there's something about this that will demand that we live differently than our individual single family homes with the white picket fence and the 2 kids in the 2-car garage and things like that. But I think there's something about this that will demand that we live differently than the ways that we've been shaped to believe we ought to live by pursuing the American dream. And for ministry, this will probably look like empowering more people to take ownership over the community, which includes leading service, running committees, significant elements of the community, even preaching. And so that's a few thoughts that I have, and I'll turn it back over.
Okay, great. Well, thanks for voicing the dilemma of an overworked culture shaping the church more than the church bearing witness to the world about what it means to really depend on God and not so much on our own resilience or human agency. I think there are several themes that coalesced in each of our speakers, but what I'd like to do right now is turn our attention to some of the questions that have been ongoing in the chat. So I'm going to start with some of the first questions that were asked as the speakers were sharing about their views on Sabbath and practice. And what I would like to invite those who are still online, if you have a question, go ahead and please ask them through the chat. Now, if you ask multiple questions, I might ask you to limit to just one, and then we can come back to your second or third question. We'll do so. But please write them in the chat, and then let me know if you prefer to just simply read the question. But I'm going to assume that if you post in the chat, you would like to unmic yourself and ask the question directly. So our first question is from Kirsten, and I'm going to struggle with your last name, Wagenius. Sorry if I mispronounced your last name, but Kirsten, you had 2 questions. Could you ask the first? I think the idea of communal Sabbath is a great opening question, something that not just our own Old Testament professor, I believe, spoke to, and that's when you typed it in, but all our panelists can speak to it. So please feel free, Kirsten, to unmic yourself, ask your question, and then if you mute yourself back as we hear a response from our panelists.
Yeah, I think Sandy and I were kind of 2 parts of a similar question of
Okay.
Maybe to the how do we Sabbath together as a community in a just way, I guess. And I know that was spoken to after I posted the question, but if you can say a little bit more, that'd be great.
Okay, great. And Sandy, since your question is very similar, could you ask your question as well?
Yeah, I always feel like when I read books on rest, as a female pastor, one thing I always assume is that the guy writing it has a stay-at-home mom at home taking care of the kids and cleaning. And so I resist that, the contemplative call. I'm also not a contemplative, so sitting still is not actually restful for me, although I need to work on that. And also, even though I am very privileged and I can take rest, there are many people, like were spoken to by Mr. Raymond Jang, that similarly, I just struggle feeling like, man, I'm privileged and my husband and I are both pastors, so we can take the time off together. And how do you call people into that? So I think you did mention that in what you said, but it feels a little bit like, oh yeah, take a vacation and do all these things, which some people literally don't have the resources for.
Okay, great. So the question is about communal Sabbaths. How do we practice Sabbath as a community? How do we be responsible for one another to create a space for Sabbath? How do we model what the world is failing at in a world where I don't think the idea of a 40-hour week exists anymore. That's a throwback to like the beginning part of the 20th century. I know that the Wall Street Journal catalogs that the average person in finance works 80 hours a week. And so that's the culture we're living in. Is it spilling into the church? So how do we be responsible for each other? That was the question. Professor Imes, would you mind responding first? And then I'll invite other panelists as they wish to share to chime in as well.
Sure. I think these are excellent questions to be asking, because I've noticed this too, that when we talk about Sabbath in the West, we're talking about solo, contemplative, unplugging. And that's not what it felt like when I was in Israel visiting and seeing how people experience Sabbath. It was like the whole family's hanging out together and spending time together. So I think I guess I would circle back around to this idea that the Sabbath instructions were given to heads of households, and that there is a disproportionate responsibility placed on those who are either leaders in households or in churches or in corporations to create conditions so that others can rest. So the focus is not so much on my maximizing my own rest, but making sure that rest can happen for those around me. And if I, as a leader, am not resting, it actually creates a culture of anxious work around me. I have a friend whose boss never takes time off. The emails come all weekend long. The meetings could happen any time of the day, 6 a.m., expecting a response right away. And so if a leader does not have good boundaries on their own work schedule, and so that they're not resting, then that creates a culture of overwork. And so I think there are simple things you can do as a leader. If your rhythms are different than others in your church or in your corporation, then you can use schedule email function. Reese, if you're on email on your Sabbath, you can schedule it to send a response the next day, so that you're training people not to expect an answer from you. As a professor, that's something I've been trying to do with students, so that if I answer on the weekend, they're not getting my answer on the weekend, so that they don't expect to get answers on the weekend. And the other thing I'll say is that it strikes me that in church history, Christians were out on the front lines of advocating for workers' rights. And that is maybe not so much the case anymore, at least not in the evangelical circles that I inhabit. But the church was the one leading the way in making sure that exploitation was not happening in factories, and that labor conditions were reasonable. So I feel like that's something that the church could revisit and recover again, and say, okay, are there people in our congregation who are unable to rest? And if they are unable to rest because someone else is creating an unworkable schedule, how can we as a community advocate for that, for those members of our congregation? Not just telling them they should rest, but actually coming alongside them and helping to work for a more just work conditions for them. So again, just to say again, that the command is being given to male heads of households. It's not a bat that's hitting the subsistence worker on the head. it's being addressed to those who have the power to do something about it. So I think all of us can order our lives in ways that are more conducive to rest, but you're absolutely right that not everyone can take a full day off. And so let's figure that out together. Why is that? And how can we push in that direction?
I think what you shared kind of adds a different way of asking the same question, and then stirring up within us different motivations. I think there's times when we have to listen to our bodies and we're exhausted and we need rest. But at the same time, even if I feel at this present moment, not resting, I want to work. What am I modeling to the community that they need rest, and they might not rest until they see myself or some other people in our community rest too. The striking example by Ray, where he grew up, because I relate to this a lot. I think no second-gen Asian American ever saw their immigrant parents rest. Vacation was not something we did. I had to learn what it meant to take vacations, and even now I'm kind of bad at it, which I'm sure my sons will profess to. So thank you for sharing that, because I think we lost that element of corporate responsibility. So that we're modeling something that is unattainable, an overworked culture that's invaded the church. So can I ask other panelists, what would you like to comment on creating spaces for others to experience? What does that look like? Maybe push pressure on our dean. What does that look like for faculty?
Well, I would. That's
Just
pretty
kidding.
specific one.
Yeah,
But I do.
not that one.
No, that's okay. It's okay.
Yeah,
I'm kind of laughing at it, but I do think that kind of gets weird is when you're thinking about the people on the bottom, Paul's self-emptying kind of language about Jesus. What does that mean for people who already been exploited? I don't think those words really apply to them. I think we're talking about the people who have relative power and position. And so for me, humility is this awakening to say there are people who can't do what we're asking them to do. I mean, it's like the guy in the story with the guy with the withered hand. I mean, this guy can't work. So we want to find a system that says, hey, how do we restore? And so I think that the onus is on the folks who have relative power and privilege to say, how do we model something different? When Dr. Adams was talking, it made me think of Dickens and a lot of his writing, but the one we're probably really all familiar with is that, Christmas Story at the end of the year, where he's talking about Scrooge. Scrooge is the model of the exploitative person, right? Who has to have a transformation before he can be generous. But I think but Dickens was speaking to the way his society was operating and was exploiting people. So I think the Christians can rise up and build some solidarity and be the ones who challenge the status quo. And I joked earlier about Chick-fil-A. I mean, I'm a vegetarian. I don't eat the chicken sandwiches, but there is something being said in that, though, when they refuse to be open on that day. There's something that's not just restricting you from getting your sandwich, but saying we place a value here in a way. And maybe there's something to be said if more Christians were able to say, we're going to challenge some things in our Western way of doing, or at least in our American way of doing.
Great. Yeah, I mean, I think how we think about our relationship with geography, time, and resources needs to be excavated a lot more. I think that there's we live in a capitalistic society where extraction and exploitation are baked into the system. And so Christian communities are called to model something different. What's hard is that we've been so deformed by what we see in terms of the American dream and the suburban life and having our own space and, getting a bigger house and a bigger space and a nicer car, that the rat race never ends. And so I think we have to really do some soul searching as communities to say, what does it look like to model something different or to participate in something different?
Pastor Sky, would you like to chime in on the conversation a bit?
Yeah, I'll just add perhaps a different view, a different perspective. We are a smaller inner city church with 6 folks on staff. We are actually hiring an operations manager right now. Praise the Lord. Hallelujah. Thank you, Jesus. But we often talk about what does Sabbath look like for each of us on staff. And we all take different days to observe our Sabbath. But because we are a parish-minded church, because we are in the community, we live in the community in which we serve, it looks a little different for us. And so we do have to put the sign on our front door and say, I'm not available today, so that our neighbors down the street don't come knocking on the door, right? So it's not just about resting from church work in the building. It's also resting from neighborhood work too. And making sure that those compassionate boundaries are set and maintained and explained even to those in our neighborhood who don't understand, like you said, Ray, who don't understand what it looks like to rest. And so we get to model that, not just for our congregation, but also for our community. And even if it's not a full 12 hours, what does it look like to steal away for an hour? What does it look like to steal away for 6 hours and to not answer the phone, not answer the door, not reply to emails or to text messages or whatever? So just a little different in our congregation / community, where we are expected to be on all the time, and we get to say, no, actually, you can rely on your other neighbor on the other side of you today while I rest and recover. So.
Great, thank you. We have a question. It's a little theological and directed a little bit more to the New Testament, but I think we can take it. So forgive me if I mispronounce your name, Dasharoth or Athad. Are you still there? Thank you for joining us from India. Would you like to ask your question directly to the panel?
Good morning from I'm Dashrath from India, Hyderabad. See, in Indian context, majorly Sunday, sometime we do have work here, and majorly people focusing here, Sabbath is a concept of, they think that Sunday may be the day that to be celebrate, to be enjoying the presence of God on the day. In Indian context, majorly we have a holiday on the day. So other kind of religious people, they thought that maybe if that in Sunday, if not given a leave for the working people, can it be the other day we can do, or is it in a context of New Testament, is it on Sunday? Like, that's what my question.
Okay, yeah, so the question, and I'm looking also at what was written in the chat, is Sabbath compulsory in the context of the New Testament? And then by your comment, I'm hearing that you're wondering, since Sabbath is on Saturday.
Yeah.
And then, so is Sunday just simply Sabbath on another day, or is it something else? And so those are interesting questions to think about. I guess one way to put it is what is the essence of Sabbath? How do we, and we don't necessarily have to practice it just on the Lord's Day. It's something that people are trying to build in to regular rhythms of life. So what should Sabbath look like from a New Testament perspective?
I think, I'm with you on that. I was going to even ask Dr. Imes what she thought, because I'm seeing in Matt's question, Matt Napier, he has somewhere, not that first, maybe it's that last one, but he asked a similar question, I thought, where he was asking about the particular day. Because I was going to ask that, does the day matter? I mean, because I was one of those pastors who took a different day because, because the weekend was so busy. So I don't know the answer to that, but compulsory is probably that's probably a problematic word for me, because I don't know what.
I mean, I want to say that we can't even talk about compulsory because we need to practice that.
Yeah, I think
it's necessary. It's necessary versus compulsory.
Yeah. But I think maybe what's behind when I see a word like that, and I don't want to speak for Brother Dasharoth, but when I think about, like, what are the consequences? Is like God going to be mad at me or something? Yeah. And so when I think about, so that's why Dr. Imes is going to be the expert. Like, how do I deal with the 10 Commandments today? Like, is God mad at me if I don't Sabbath exactly right or something? But I guess so for me, I guess what I'm saying is Sabbath is necessary, bar borrow your language there.
Mm.
I would say, yes, it's true in the New Testament, but I don't think it's something that, at least I was trying to say earlier, that should be approached with rules as much as it's approached with these bigger pictures of restoration, flourishing, wholeness, health, those kinds of things that I think are really more what is the compulsion? What does it mean for us to pursue this shalom and wholeness? But I'll leave it to others.
Okay. Anyone on our panelists want to comment on the question?
I'm asked this question a lot. Does it matter which day we keep the Sabbath? And is God going to punish us if we don't? So I feel like I'm treading carefully here because I don't feel 100% certain of my answer, but this is what I tell students. I think the principle of 1 day in 7 is more important than the particular day. And the reason why I suspect that's the case is because we do not live in a theocracy. There's something different about ancient Israel gathering around the tabernacle and being camped together in the wilderness and having the same rhythm, because everyone in the community is part of that rhythm. We don't live in a society like that today. So if I take Sabbath, if I do Sabbath, well, if everyone in my congregation Sabbaths on the same day, we all live in different neighborhoods, so our neighbors aren't even going to know we're all doing it on the same day. So I don't know if it accomplishes the same objectives as having the same Sabbath accomplished in an Old Testament context. I say that with a bit of reservation because I appreciate Matt's question later about, like, are we just choosing what's convenient for us rather than obeying God? It is taken very seriously in an Old Testament context. And we do have a man who's put to death for collecting sticks, firewood on the Sabbath. So this is something God is taking very seriously, but I suspect that the day that it's being taken seriously is partly due to the kind of society that they had, namely it's agriculturally based. And it's ethnically, well, it's not one ethnicity, but there is a sense of cohesion around the worship of Yahweh. And so that there's something possible in that context that isn't as possible in ours. So I tend to think it doesn't matter as much which day, but if everyone in a household is picking a different day, then I wonder if it actually works very well. So those are some initial thoughts.
I mean, it also ties, so Matt Napier's asked that his questions be asked for him because he doesn't have audio. So I think I would just tie, and he asked a lot of questions. I might tie it to the observation that he made, which was really interesting, that in order for Israel to rest, the priests had to work. They had to create space. So could you comment on that tension? So do we find in the Old Testament the work around the tabernacle, is that a really good model for how leaders rest, or is this more of an example where our social responsibility is to provide rest? So we might work when others rest, but then we find other places to rest, and hence the Monday, the Tuesday, or the other days of the week.
Yeah.
Is there a biblical principle there? Is there a tension that you recognize that rest doesn't happen for the entire nation all at once?
I mean, yes, I think even Jesus points this out, doesn't he? Like even the priests in the temple are breaking the Sabbath. And so Matt is right that we don't have a clear, at least not one that I can think of, a clear instruction around Sinai saying that the priests are supposed to pick a different day to rest. But there is evidence later in Israel's history of a rotation. I don't think that tabernacle, like I'm thinking out loud here, but I don't think tabernacle service was especially busy on the Sabbath compared to other days. It is not as though that was the day everyone came and brought sacrifices. Sacrifices weren't, as far as I understand it, on a kind of weekly cyclical schedule. So the only sacrifices that would have to happen on the Sabbath are if an 8th day circumcision was happening, like then there would be activity on the Sabbath. But other than that, I would think most activity happened on other days. So yes, the lamps needed to be lit, the bread needs to be put out, the incense needs to be offered. So there's a little bit of work going on, but it's not especially strenuous. I don't know if it's quite the same thing as what pastors are dealing with today, where our main gathering takes place on the day we've designated to rest. That feels a little different.
Hear that.
Thank you. There's a question that was asked by Tom Rosier, but I think we answered it in the course of our conversations. I hope you don't mind, Tom, if I named the question, but I think we have answered it in part. How does a church change a culture that has not provided sabbaticals for pastors? So, so I think we have to begin with ourselves. I think that's what I'm hearing.
Yeah.
The church has to change its culture.
I would say something practical in that one though too,
Okay.
because they, you know, I mean, it's like Lily and these places, they have these grants for pastors that, and I never got one. But I also realize some churches are, they think, well, we give you a little bit of a vacation, and they don't think that of, but they would not call that Sabbath or wouldn't even think about it. I have been the guest speaker in other people's churches where I've advocated for that. So I think one of the practical things is that sometimes that leader, she or he can't necessarily get that board or that church body to see it differently, but might take an outside voice to come and help.
Okay.
Because I do think a culture shift does need to happen in some ways. That's a kind of a church specific thing, but I think some of our questions are broader than that. But I think in the church context, sometimes that outside voice can be helpful. And that's sometimes where denominations help. You can get leadership to come and help the church think that through in terms of a policy of sabbatical.
Okay. I want to take a presider's privilege and ask the last question for each of our panelists. Could you just share your best personal practice for Sabbath? What do you like doing? I would just love to hear from each of you. And maybe that's something we can all grab onto and try to do ourselves. How about we begin with Pastor VC?
Yeah, because I do observe my Sabbath on a Wednesday, I typically will light a candle on Tuesday night at 9 p.m. and then light it again on Wednesday night at 9 p.m. It's just for me, it's just a visual marker of, all right, Reese, things are getting ready to change over the next 12 hours, you know? And so I immediately do that. I am a foodie. I love to eat really, really, really good food. And so Sabbath for me, it looks like, I mean, yes, stop, rest, delight, and contemplate, but I really emphasize delight. And so I'll go to a new restaurant by myself. Maybe I won't eat in the restaurant. Maybe I'll take it to go and head out to the park where I'm able to just enjoy nature, enjoy the elements. I really take advantage of what Fresno has to offer in terms of just, you know, really great weather. And I just spend time. I spend time with Jesus. I take my journal and my Bible, and I literally just open it up and I just say, okay, Lord, what do you want to say? What do you want to talk about? You know, like I'm listening and I know that you're listening. So let's just hang out today. And so it really is, it's not pressure. It is more about just hanging out with God, just hanging out with him. And I try to model that for our staff who also take that day to Sabbath as well. So yeah, it's just real simple, real practical, good meal and Jesus.
I love how you made the restaurant and the meal a sacred space to God. So thank you. We got to find our sacred spaces in life.
Amen.
All right.
That's right. And savor.
Yeah.
Don't rush through the meal, but take my time and enjoy it.
Great. Pastor Ray, you want to share your best practice?
Yeah, I just schedule it. I think because I feel like I'm stretched so thin. If I don't block it off on my calendar, then something else gets filled. And so that's probably the best thing for me to do is just schedule it. And then I do something that disrupts my rhythms.
Yeah, I'm going to jump in and say I'm the same in that I have to block something off, and it's changed over the years what I do, depending like what season I'm in, what kind of ministry I've been doing. But it is disrupting. That's a good word for me. It's like, Dennis, do something that's fun and refreshing and rejuvenating and give God the glory. So, but that changes for me. Sometimes it's a longer day at the gym because I like the gym. So.
All right.
I would say for me, the Sabbath rhythm became really important when I was in seminary. And I was a mom of 3 small children. there was always more to read. There was always another paper to write. And it was a real act of faith for me to set that aside for a whole day and just be present with my family. And so we started having family adventures on Sunday afternoons, and I would religiously not do homework. But we would go for a bike ride or go for a walk or have a picnic at the park or something. That was when the kids were littler. Now they're teenagers and the rhythms are different. But I'm so glad that I discovered that practice in seminary, because once I got into my PhD, it would have been impossible to take a rest if I was waiting to rest until I got all my work done. It's really an act of just saying, no, I am finite and I am not a machine. I'm not going to work like I'm a machine. And so I'm setting aside PhD reading and writing and whatever for a whole day. And now as a faculty member, I find that, yeah, the to-do list is always longer than the time that I have to give it. And so for me, it's an act of faith to say, the world does not revolve around me, and I'm not keeping the world going around. I don't keep it rotating. And so if I stop, it means that I'm dethroning myself. When we work constantly, it's a form of idolatry, because it's like we think that it depends on us, but it doesn't. I really love what Raymond shared earlier about delegating and deputizing others to participate in the ministry, so that it's not all, because it can actually inflate your ego to think, well, I'm in high demand. People are asking me to do things. People need me. People want me. And that is such an insidious form of idolatry. And so to say, no, I have limits and I must rest. And then to suggest, have you asked so-and-so, or how about so-and-so, and to give other people the opportunity to be involved. I wonder if that's part of answering the question of how do we shift a church culture towards Sabbath, if our churches are not concerned that everything rides on that pastor. But if they've seen evidence that other people can step in and run a service, other people can prepare communion, other people can preach, it doesn't have to all be the same person all the time. So whether in a church context or in my context in academia, I've been learning to say no and to suggest other people to do it instead, and it opens up opportunities for them. And so then practically for me on a Sabbath, I love to go for a walk and listen to a podcast and just enjoy the weather and feel no need to produce anything. I love to read, so I'm usually reading. It's usually biblical studies, even on a Sunday, because that's what I really enjoy, but it's not something someone's making me read. It's not class prep. It's just personal enrichment. And that's been really life-giving for me. But just to be available, like, hey, hun, let's watch our show together. Hey, kids, do you want to hang out and bake cookies? Like, being available to others and not being a slave to my to-do list is really the main thing.
That's a great word to end our session with. I mean, the idea of sharing our work so we can also share our rest.
Yeah.
And then somehow make that a rhythm of life. And that is the church's witness to the world. I think that's a challenge for all of us to embrace. I really want to thank our panelists. Again, Dr. Carmen Imes, Dr. Dennis Edwards, Reverend Raymond Chang, and Reverend Reese Sky. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for your wisdom. Thank you for being real, and thank you for sharing from your personal experience. Your testimonies will linger with us, and we're challenged by that. Could I ask Paul, then Pastor, but also Professor Paul, then could you close us out with a few announcements and also a word of prayer?
Yes, I just want to affirm what Max just shared. We want to really express our appreciation to each and every one of you for your participation, especially our guests, but all of you who came online and listened. We pray that this would be an effective way to live into our theology. And we want to just keep you abreast of the fact that next year we will be doing this again, next academic year. So keep tuned for what North Park Theological Seminary is going to be doing in public theology again next year. We'll be sending out more announcements as the topic and the dates are announced. Thank you again for all of your participation. I'd like us to just close with a word of prayer together. Lord of the Sabbath, we are extremely grateful for these powerful insights that you have provided to us through your servants. Lord, give each one of us your pace. Bring us into that promised rest that you have told us about, that you desire for us, so that we could truly model and serve in the life-giving, flourishing way that you desire for all of your creation. We give ourselves again to you for our filling that we need from you, and to allow ourselves to let you be God. Thank you again. We praise you for all you are doing. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen.